America, or the United States of America. There are 50 states in the country, and if you're into geography, you probably know most of them, although not all, because even Ross Geller couldn't remember all 50. But what if instead of the 50, there were 87? I know what you're thinking, that's absolutely insane. How could there be 87 states? But there could be. Last week, I came across this book called Lost States, True Stories of States That Never Made It by Michael Trinkling. In it, he lists at least 37 regions of the contiguous United States that at one point or another tried to become their own state, but failed. Some are more serious than others, some are real movements, others are just protests or jokes. However, all of them are a good opportunity to learn about the regions they represent and what was behind the more or less serious desire for local autonomy. I think the best way to start this is with an overview of the entire map of the book. The only print that I could find, or rather scan, was on Internet Archive. I'll link it below. It's not super high quality. I tinkered around in Photoshop to increase the brightness and contrast, so bear with the quality, please. I made my own to overlay it and will mostly be using that throughout the video, but I thought the original looked cool too, so maybe we can use it for this initial look. Immediately out west, we have a myriad of potential new states. Jefferson taking up South Oregon and North California, a separate South California, then the gigantic Deseret state, which the Mormons wanted to set up, taking up parts of other proposed states like Nataqua in West Nevada, the Native American Navajo, or Montezuma in New Mexico and Arizona. Up north in Washington, Idaho, and Oregon, we would have a state of Lincoln. Moving west, another one, Chippewa, as well as Absaroka. Plus an earlier draft of Minnesota with different borders than the actual Minnesota state has today, as well as a separate state of Superior, taking away Michigan's exclave in Wisconsin. Texas and Oklahoma would be completely butchered here, with new states like South Texas, Jacinto, Sequoyah, and Texlahoma taking up their land, the later borders a potential West Kansas. As we move east, there's a smaller incidence of state proposals, but we still see a good amount here. Yazoo in Alabama and Mississippi, West and South Florida, Transoconee in middle of Georgia, Franklin in East Tennessee, and then three big adjacent ones, Transylvania, Vandalia, and half of Ohio becoming an early attempt at a state of Washington. Speaking of names that ended up being used elsewhere, there would be a Wyoming inside of Pennsylvania, plus a new Connecticut colony in northern Ohio, and half of Maine would become Acadia. Then we would have minor places becoming states like Boston, Chicago, New York City, Long Island, South Jersey, Chesapeake, Potomac, I imagine being Washington, D.C., as well as this one called Forgottonia in Illinois. Talk about a passive-aggressive name. So now that we got an overview of the entire map, let's go into a little bit of detail for each of them. Let's start from west to east, but there's timestamps in the video if you want to skip ahead to a specific one. Starting with Lincoln. The name Lincoln has been associated with multiple statehood proposals. One notable instance involved this region of eastern Washington and the Idaho Panhandle in the early 20th century. Residents felt underrepresented by their distant state capitals and sought to form a new state named Lincoln to address their unique regional concerns. Despite the efforts, the proposal didn't gain sufficient traction to become a reality. Their proposed flag is similar to that of Washington state, but red and with the face of Abraham Lincoln on it. Recently, a similar proposal of creating a greater Idaho state has been put forth, stealing East Oregon. Locals have mostly approved it, but Oregon is never going to let it happen. Another proposed state was the state of Jefferson, which has also surfaced in various forms, most notably in 1941 when counties in North California and Southern Oregon sought to create a new state due to, again, perceived neglect from their respective state governments. The movement gained momentum, even declaring an intent to secede, but was halted by the onset of World War II, which of course shifted national priorities. This really seems like a region where locals feel disenfranchised. Their flag used two X's on the seal to represent a double-cross feeling of abandonment by the governments of both states. Moving south, we have the concept of South California, and throughout time there have been a lot of proposals to divide this big state. In this case, proponents argue that the vast size and diverse interests of areas of California warranted a division to ensure a more effective governance. Despite that periodic interest, proposals have not really advanced significantly. There was one about creating 6 Californias that had some media traction, but nothing too serious. To the west would be Nataqua. In 1856, settlers in the area now known as Western Nevada and Northeastern California declared the Republic of Nataqua to establish local governance in a region largely ignored by existing authorities. The name derived from a Native American word. However, the republic was short-lived, and the territory was soon incorporated into the Nevada Territory, which then evolved into its own state. Taking up that territory and a lot more was the proposed megastate of Deseret. In 1849, Mormon pioneers led by Brigham Young proposed it, encompassing a vast area of the Southwest, including present-day Utah, Nevada, and parts of other states. The U.S. government, however, established the Utah Territory in 1850, significantly reducing the proposed boundaries of Deseret. Utah is still heavily Mormon, as are many of the surrounding areas of neighboring states, but it ended up not being created. Their proposed flag was very similar to the US one. Nearby we have a tiny one, almost not visible when you look at the map, and it was called Lost Dakota. Now, it already doesn't make sense that we have 2 Dakotas, so imagine having a third. Lost Dakota refers to a portion of land that was omitted from territorial maps in the late 19th century. Essentially, whoever split up and organized the territories forgot to assign this piece of land to anyone. The oversight left the area without formal governance for a period of time, leading to its nickname. Eventually, the land was incorporated into the surrounding states, resolving the jurisdictional ambiguity. It was never a proposed state in a serious way, just a fun map mistake. But returning to more serious proposals, we have the case of Navajo. There have been attempts to establish a state named Navajo, centered precisely around the Navajo Nation's territory in the Four Corners region. Advocates argue that statehood would provide greater autonomy and recognition for the native people. However, these proposals have not progressed. The Navajo Nation remains a sovereign entity within the United States, just without its own state, as is the case, unfortunately, with all other Native American nations inside the country. The flag of the Navajo Nation depicts the potential borders of that state along with other symbols. Further south, we have Montezuma, a proposed state named after an Aztec emperor, it seems. In the mid-19th century, there was a proposal to create the state of Montezuma from parts of New Mexico territory. The aim was to establish a state with a significant Hispanic population, reflecting the area's cultural heritage within the Spanish Empire. However, the proposal didn't get sufficient support and was eventually abandoned. A fun fact, the original proposal was early on in US history, so it left out the territory that is now American but wasn't at the time, being acquired from Mexico later through the Gadsden Purchase. Further north, the proposed state of Chippewa emerged in the 19th century, aiming to carve out a new state from parts of Wisconsin and Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The name honored the Ojibwe, the Chippewa people indigenous to the region. Despite some local support, the proposal didn't advance. Nearby was another attempt, Absaroka. In 1939, during the Great Depression, residents from parts of Wyoming, Montana, and South Dakota expressed dissatisfaction with federal policies and proposed forming this state in protest. They even issued license plates and held a Miss Absaroka beauty pageant. However, like other cases, the movement lacked formal recognition and dissipated with the onset of World War II. And using the name of a current US state, we have an alternate Minnesota. Before its current boundaries were established, there were proposals for a larger state of Minnesota that would have included significant portions of what are now North and South Dakota. However, political negotiations and the creation of separate territories led to the more confined borders that the state has today. But hey, if you are from Minnesota and you want to pursue a greater Minnesota policy, maybe you can use these maps as a claim for your neighboring state's territory. One state that many fans of clean borders would like is Superior. In the 1970s, residents of Michigan's Upper Peninsula felt underrepresented, it seems to always be the case, and proposed the state of Superior, citing economic and cultural differences from Lower Michigan. The movement sought greater autonomy but lacked sufficient political support to proceed. And speaking of the Great Lakes, we have two examples within Illinois. At various points in history, there have been discussions about Chicago seceding from Illinois to form its own state. Proponents argue the urban interests often clash with the more rural priorities of the rest of the state. No serious movements have formed around this, and having such a small region of a state might be odd, although they do have a lot of people there. Some people have done the same for other major cities like Boston or NYC. On the opposite end of the spectrum, in the 1970s, residents of Western Illinois humorously proposed the state of Forgottonia to protest perceived neglect by state and federal governments. They just thought that they had forgotten about them, but it was more of a joke than anything else. A more interesting proposal can be found in the South. In the late 19th century, settlers in the western regions of Kansas felt disconnected from the eastern part of the state due to vast distances and differing economic interests, which led to a discussion about forming a separate state. But again, it didn't get enough traction and the idea was abandoned. While that one cut off a piece of one existing state, the next one cut off pieces of two. In the early 20th century, residents along the Texas Panhandle and Oklahoma border proposed combining both regions to form Texlahoma. The initiative aimed to address administrative inefficiencies in the region, but of course, neither state supported losing part of their territories. In Oklahoma itself, we have another example of an attempted Native American state. In 1905, leaders of the 5 civilized tribes in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, proposed the state of Sequoyah to ensure Native American self-governance in the U.S. They drafted a constitution and petitioned Congress, but the federal government rejected their proposal and turned it instead into the state of Oklahoma in 1907, which, to be fair, is mostly native land today and used the Sequoyah Constitution draft as a basis for their own. Back in Texas, Jacinto was a proposed state in the early days, named after the decisive battle of San Jacinto that secured their independence from Mexico. The idea was never really taken serious. In fact, there have been multiple efforts to divide Texas. South Texas often is suggested as a separate state due to different cultures and economic characteristics. Some people wanted to name it Lincoln as well. However, the state has such a strong identity and political structure that it prevents any partitions and secessions. I think their own independence from the US would be more likely here. In Mississippi and Alabama, we have an attempt that has a really weird name, Yazoo. It all happened because of the Yazoo scandal. It was a massive real estate fraud perpetrated in the mid-1790s by Georgia Governor George Matthews and the Georgia General Assembly. What it seems to have happened is that Georgia politicians sold large tracts of territory in the Yazoo lands to political insiders at very low prices. However, the corruption involved in the land deals resulted in widespread controversy and the plan was abandoned. So I guess it was essentially Georgia trying to expand into that territory by private means, but I really couldn't find much information about this. Moving to Florida, we have 2 separate attempts. In 1810, settlers in what is now Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama declared independence from Spain, forming the Republic of West Florida. It lasted only a few months before the US annexed the territory, preventing it from becoming its own state. It's arguably if the whole thing was planned and a part of the US strategy to force Spain to sell the entirety of Florida to them. South Florida has also seen repeated proposals for statehood due to its economic and political differences from the rest of the state. Advocates argue that Miami and the surrounding region have different needs, but they haven't been able to go through with it. Back in Georgia in the late 1700s, settlers in the Oconee region attempted to form an independent state to escape control from Georgia's government. The movement was quickly suppressed and the area remained a part of Georgia. It would be quite odd to have a landlocked state inside of another one. And using the same name as the Romanian region, known for its vampires and Hungarian separatism, some people sought to create the state of Transylvania from lands in present-day Kentucky and Tennessee, a land land speculator had purchased the lands from Cherokee tribes to do it, but the Virginia colony had claimed them as well. Because of this, the Continental Congress refused to recognize it, and the land was absorbed into what eventually would become the state of Kentucky. Right next to it, Vandalia was another proposed state in the 18th century. It was a group of settlements, which were never approved by the British Crown and had no colonial government, although some Virginians and Pennsylvanians had settled there. After the American Revolutionary War, the settlers sought unsuccessfully to be admitted as a state called Westsylvania. However, they had no legal title to the land and were opposed by the governments of both Virginia and Pennsylvania, which both claimed the area as their own under the old colonial charters. Ultimately, the federal government split the area between Pennsylvania and Virginia instead. And a third major one in the region is this one. While today the US has a state called Washington, throughout time there were different movements that have proposed creating a separate state with that name. One attempt took place in what is now the eastern half of Ohio. In 1802, as Ohio prepared for statehood, some settlers in the eastern region, particularly in the Virginia Military District, sought to create a separate state called Washington, feeling politically and economically disconnected from the West. But Congress rejected it, favoring Ohio's admission as a single state. Further south, some people also wanted to create a new state named after Benjamin Franklin. In 1784, settlers in what is now eastern Tennessee declared the state of Franklin, seeking independence from North Carolina. The government functioned for several years but lacked a formal federal recognition. In 1788, it collapsed and was reabsorbed into Northern Carolina. Interestingly enough, later on during the Civil War period, that same part of Tennessee tried to break away again, along with the northern Alabama region, to create a state of Nickjack. People in the region were against siding with the South and seceding from the Union. Seeing the example of West Virginia splitting from secessionist Virginia, they'd tried to do the same, but unfortunately failed. To the east, some residents of Washington, D.C. have advocated for statehood under the name Potomac, I imagine after the river, to gain representation in Congress. This is an ongoing issue up to today, with the federal district wanting congressional representation with voting rights. The same issue exists for many U.S. territories, such as Puerto Rico, which are taxed but have no real political representation, and I seem to remember some historical revolution taking place under the motto "no taxation without representation," but I guess they just forgot about that detail. Another potential small state breakaway could be South Jersey. Then we move to Pennsylvania and Wyoming at the same time. Not to be confused with the modern western state, Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania was a contested territory in the 18th century. Connecticut settlers attempted to claim it, leading to violent clashes with Pennsylvania forces. As a result, some locals wanted to separate and become their own state, but it just ended up remaining within Pennsylvania. If it had been created, I guess Wyoming would have had to come up with a different name. Nearby, the Chesapeake region, including parts of Maryland and Virginia, has occasionally been suggested as a separate state, but without much support. Similar to New York City, Long Island has considered statehood, but never been able to find enough supporters to move forward. And before becoming a part of Ohio, the Connecticut Western Reserve was briefly known as New Connecticut. Settlers attempted to establish a separate identity, but the region was ultimately incorporated into Ohio. It was essentially claimed by Connecticut at a distance and would have been a colony of the already existing state, a pretty interesting concept, to be honest. In Maine, there was an idea of an Acadian state that stems from the historical French colony of Acadia, which once encompassed parts of modern Maine and Canada. Some Franco-American communities have advocated for greater recognition, and this could potentially steal a part of Canada's New England region, but no real statehood movement has emerged. So those are about 37 potential state proposals that never came to fruition. What do you think about this? Do you think any of these states would have made sense? Even if they didn't make sense, would you have liked any of them to exist? And were there any other proposed states that I didn't mention in this video? Let me know in the comments, along with your opinions and thoughts about this whole crazy idea. Thank you so much to my patrons for supporting me directly, and thank you to you for watching this video. I'm going to stop recording now because my eyes are tearing up from very strong sun in the window, and I will see you next time for more general knowledge. Today's movement cup is another repeat. It is the building. I think it's my favorite because it's like they're all living together, you know? and it's sunny. Finally, we've had like these storms for the past 2 weeks that have just depressed everybody. So now I think spring is coming.